Have you ever kept a family secret for decades? I won't ask what, just curious.
They said they were too busy. Not even sorry, not even ashamed, just casually unavailable, like I'd invited them to a church bake sale or a last-minute yard sale, not the biggest night of my career. It wasn't just an award. It was the culmination of 23 years of early mornings, broken copy machines, unruly kids, and faculty meetings that went in circles. 23 years of quiet dedication, of giving pieces of myself to kids whose own families barely noticed them, while my own family did the same damn thing to me. I wasn't asking for a parade. I was asking them to show up. But instead, I got 4 empty chairs in the front row, and let me tell you, those chairs said more than any of them ever did. The invitation wasn't a group text. It wasn't a Facebook post. I had done it the old-fashioned way, picked out thick cream cardstock, hand-wrote a note inside each one, even added RSVP cards like it was a wedding or some kind of gala. I thought maybe, just maybe, making it formal would make it feel more real to them. Like they couldn't ignore it this time. I mailed them out 3 weeks in advance. I followed up. I even reminded my mother on the phone 2 days before, and all she said was, "That's this Friday, right?" "Oh, honey, we'll see what we can do." You know how things pile up. Pile up? What the hell piles up on a Friday night at 7 o'clock for people who've been retired for a decade and whose idea of a big night out is hitting the early bird at Golden Corral? But I smiled through it. I smiled when my sister Janice replied with a snarky little text, "Would love to, but Todd's golf dinner is the same night. Prior commitments, you understand." As if her husband's 4th-place trophy in some HOA men's league tournament was more important than her own sister receiving the State Excellence in Education Award. But sure, Janice, go clap for Todd's backswing. That's what you've always done. Clapped for everyone else, stayed silent for me. So I arrived at the banquet hall alone, wearing a navy blue pantsuit I had splurged on from a real boutique, not a clearance rack. I had my hair done for the first time in months, a soft blowout that actually made me feel like a woman again, not just a walking lesson plan. When I walked into that room, dozens of other educators were there with entourages, husbands, wives, kids, grandkids, balloons, bouquets, cheering sections, and I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I was here for the work, not the photo op. But when they called my name, and I walked to that stage, and I looked out across the faces, I saw them immediately. The 4 seats in the front row with my last name on laminated cards, seats I had reserved myself. They were empty. For white squares, clean and cold like blank tombstones. I held the plaque in my hands, heavy and warm from the presenter's grip, and I looked out into that room full of strangers. I had prepared a speech short, safe, sweet. Thank the district. Thank the students, thank the board. That's what I had written. But when I opened my mouth, something else came out. Something I didn't even plan. I said, "This one's for the family who didn't clap for me then. Don't fake it now." And then I smiled. That kind of smile you smile when something inside you finally breaks free, not in anger, but in exhaustion. Because that line didn't come from bitterness, it came from decades of being overlooked, ignored, minimized. It was the line of a woman who had spent a lifetime biting her tongue and finally decided to let the blood drip. There was a pause in the room. You could feel it. Not uncomfortable, more like surprised respect. And then the applause started. Not from my family, but from people who had heard the same silence from their own. Teachers with no support systems, single moms, caretakers, the invisible ones. They clapped like they understood. Some even stood up. And I realized right then, strangers had done more for my soul in 10 seconds than my blood relatives had done in 46 years. Afterward, there were photos, handshakes, polite chatter. I didn't linger. I didn't cry either. I took my plaque, got in my car, and drove home in silence. I passed my parents' street on the way and didn't even glance toward it. I wasn't interested in what they were doing that night anymore. I was more interested in what they were not doing, watching their daughter make history. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the night had settled into that soft, breathless quiet that only comes after rain. I turned off the car, sat there for a second, and finally looked at my phone. 12 missed calls. 6 voicemails. A few texts. all from people who couldn't find time for me 3 hours earlier. And that's when I knew I had stirred something. Not because they cared. No, they didn't suddenly feel pride. They felt exposed. But I wasn't ready to listen yet. Not to all of it. I poured myself a glass of wine, placed my plaque gently on the kitchen table, and hit play on the first voicemail. Melissa, what was that supposed to mean? Are you seriously trying to humiliate us in front of everyone? I took a sip of wine, then another. The voice kept talking, but it felt like background noise now. I had said what needed to be said. And the best part? I hadn't named a single name. That was the beauty of it, they exposed themselves. The next message started with a sob. Janice. She was crying. I don't understand why you had to go that far. I mean, we've all had busy lives, Mel. It's not like we didn't want to be there. No, Janice. You didn't want to be there. That's exactly the point. You didn't even pretend. And now? Now the pretending begins. The retroactive support. The backpedaling. Each voicemail chipped away at a piece of the myth they had built, the myth that we were a tight-knit family, that we had each other's backs, that they were there for me in any meaningful way. They weren't. And the truth, the raw, cracked open truth, was finally echoing back to them on a recording. But then I got to the last voicemail. The one I didn't expect. It was from my brother Daryl. And his voice was different, not angry, not performative. Just quiet. Real. I heard what you said, and I know why you said it. Call me when you're ready. Please. And that's when I paused the player. Because in all the noise, his message felt like something else. Not guilt. Not rage. Maybe, just maybe, regret. But that's where it started. Not at the award. Not in the applause. It started in the silence that followed. And trust me, what came next made that award look like a spark before the wildfire. The house was dark when I got in, that kind of deep, velvety dark that presses in on you after an emotional night, the kind where your body still vibrates from adrenaline, but your mind has already started the slow, painful descent into reflection. I didn't bother turning on the lights. I walked straight into the kitchen, shoes still on, handbag sliding off my shoulder, the award plaque gripped in one hand like a weapon I wasn't sure I had used correctly. I set it down on the kitchen table, next to the stack of unpaid bills, grocery flyers, and a half-empty coffee mug from the morning that now felt like it belonged to a different lifetime. I poured myself another glass of wine, not because I was celebrating, but because I needed to feel something warm after the cold silence of 4 empty chairs staring back at me all night like ghosts of people who were alive but never really present. I sat down at the kitchen table, took a long sip, and picked up my phone again. 12 missed calls. 6 voicemails. A handful of texts. Each one carrying the weight of 1,000 unsaid things, or maybe just the same tired excuses I'd been fed for decades, now hastily rewritten into rehearsed concern. I didn't want to listen to them, not really. But something in me needed to. Maybe it was the part of me that still held onto a flicker of belief that one of them might finally say the right thing, the honest thing, not the performative apology, not the guilt-drenched manipulation, but something real. I pressed play on the first voicemail, and right away, my mother's voice filled the room with that same clipped, careful tone she'd used since I was a child, a voice that sounded more like a principal scolding a student than a mother trying to understand her daughter. Melissa, I don't understand what you meant by that speech. I mean, we've always supported you in our own way. You didn't have to make a scene. You really hurt a lot of feelings tonight. It was almost comical, in a bitter way, how she managed to make my moment of pain about their feelings, how she sidestepped the fact that her absence had been a wound and instead focused on the sting of being called out for it. I didn't even make a scene. I had spoken one sentence. One sentence that told the truth. And that was what really upset them, the truth, not the delivery. The second message was Janice. Her voice, always so perfectly rehearsed and sharp-edged, cracked with what I assumed was some mixture of anger and embarrassment. Mel, what the hell was that? I had no idea you were harboring so much resentment. We've all had our struggles, you know. You're not the only one who's had to work hard. She paused, then added, Todd was furious. He said it was unprofessional. Honestly, you made it awkward for everyone. Yes, Janice. God forbid I make Todd uncomfortable while he slurps wine at some banquet about his midlife hobby. Heaven forbid my honesty ruin your reputation for being the calm, collected, image-obsessed older sister who always showed up just enough to look good, but never long enough to actually be of any use. She was furious because the facade cracked, and it wasn't me who cracked it. It was the silence around them that finally made noise. The third voicemail was from my father, and hearing his voice again hit me in a way I didn't expect. There was a pause before he even said anything, the kind of long, heavy pause I remembered from childhood, when I'd sit across the dinner table from him waiting for a compliment or even just a question about my day that never came. When he finally spoke, it was gruff, quiet, and uncertain. We didn't know it meant that much. I guess we figured you'd be fine either way. That was all he said. And then he hung up. I figured you'd be fine either way. That was the story of my life. Melissa, the strong one. Melissa, the independent one. Melissa, the one who didn't need praise or support or hugs or celebration because she'd figure it out herself. And maybe that was true, but only because they gave me no other choice. They built me like a house meant to withstand every storm, and then they wondered why I stopped letting them in. The remaining voicemails were mostly variations on the same theme, confusion masquerading as concern, irritation wrapped in self-defense. It was like they all got together, compared notes, and decided the best way to respond to my statement wasn't with introspection, but with collective deflection. And then came the last one. Daryl. His voice was different, not because he said anything particularly profound, but because he didn't sound like he was performing. He wasn't trying to sound right. He wasn't putting on the usual, I'm your baby brother who just needs a little more time to get his act together act. He just sounded tired. Mel, I heard what you said. And I get it. I really do. I know we messed up. I know I did. But I also know why you said it. And I think we need to talk. Not yell. Not text. Just talk. I'll come by. Whenever you're ready. Please. That one stuck with me. Maybe because Daryl and I were never close in the way TV siblings are, the kind who share secrets and cover for each other and hug it out at Christmas, but we had a kind of quiet understanding growing up. He knew what it felt like to disappoint our parents in a different way, to be seen as the one who needed fixing instead of the one who was just ignored. And maybe, in his messiness, he was the only one who actually saw me. Or tried to. I sat there, wine glass half empty, plaque glinting in the low kitchen light, and thought about how strange it was that success didn't feel like success until it forced everyone else to see themselves reflected in it. They weren't calling because they were proud of me. They were calling because they had been unmasked. Because a single sentence, spoken clearly and without apology, had shattered a narrative they'd carefully preserved for decades. The thing is, I didn't even say their names. I didn't point fingers. I didn't rant. I just told the truth in the most efficient way possible, that when it mattered most, they weren't there. And now, suddenly, they wanted to pretend they always had been. But truth has a way of lingering. It echoes louder than lies. It stains clean reputations. It doesn't go away just because you cover it up with phone calls and crocodile tears. I set the phone down. I didn't delete the messages. I didn't call anyone back. Not yet. Instead, I walked into the living room, curled up on the couch with the plaque balanced on my lap like a fragile piece of armor, and let the silence settle in again. This time, though, it didn't feel so lonely. It felt earned. Some ghosts aren't dead. They're just relatives who never showed up. And for the first time in a long, long time, I wasn't afraid of them anymore. It was late the next evening when I heard the knock on the door, that dull, uncertain kind of knock that comes from someone who isn't sure if they'll be welcomed or told to get lost, and when I opened it to find Daryl standing there, shoulders slouched, eyes red-rimmed, and a paper bag of something cheap and probably half-formed dangling from one hand, I didn't feel anger or bitterness or even pity. What I felt, more than anything, was a strange, almost reluctant familiarity, the way you feel when a long-lost song plays and you don't know whether to sing along or shut it off entirely. He looked older than I remembered, older than he should have, his once boyish charm now dulled by too many years of bad decisions and apologies that came too late, but there was something honest in his face. Something that hadn't been there in any of the voicemails from the rest of the family. Something unpolished and human and unscripted. He didn't speak at first, just sort of hovered there like he wasn't sure he'd made the right call showing up unannounced, and when I stepped aside to let him in, he walked through the doorway like someone entering a sacred place they'd long since been exiled from. Shoulders slightly hunched, hands in his pockets, eyes avoiding mine. He set the bag down on the kitchen counter without a word, and we sat him at the kitchen table, me across from him, the plaque still there between us like a silent witness to everything unsaid. For a moment, the only sound was the humming of the old fridge and the faint creak of the wood under our chairs, and then, slowly, carefully, he began to speak, voice low and thick with things he hadn't told anyone in years. "I didn't come to argue," he said, eyes fixed on the table, not on me. "Didn't come to defend anyone. I figured you might want to hear some truth, and I owed it to you to finally say it." I waited, not because I didn't have 100 sharp, bitter words on the tip of my tongue, but because I could tell that if I spoke too soon, I'd lose whatever fragile thing he was trying to hold together. "I was gonna come," he said, and I believed him, even though I hated that I did. I even got a shirt out, ironed it and everything. Thought, hell, maybe this time I could be the brother who showed up on time. The one who didn't screw it up. But then Mom called. He paused then, let out a breath that felt more like a confession than an exhale. "She told me not to. Said it was your night, not ours. Said we'd just make it about ourselves if we came. Said you didn't need us there to shine." My hand tightened around the stem of my wine glass, but I said nothing, let him continue. "At first, I thought she was just being selfless, you know? Like maybe she was finally trying to give you space. But then she said something else. She said Melissa always had to be the star. Let her have this one alone." He looked at me then, and for the first time in years, really looked at me, with guilt clouding his expression in a way that wasn't performative, that wasn't meant to excuse, but to simply acknowledge. "I think she wanted to punish you for not needing her," he said. "I think she always hated that you didn't beg for her attention like the rest of us did." The room went still, and for a long minute, I didn't know how to respond because everything in me was simultaneously screaming I knew it, and why the hell did it take so long to say it out loud? Because that was the cruelest part of growing up in our house, wasn't it? That silent, ever-present competition for love that none of us ever admitted we were in. I remembered being 17, coming home with a scholarship letter from a university out of state, and how Mom had looked more irritated than proud, like my success had inconvenienced her dinner plans. I remembered Janice accidentally throwing it away the next day, saying she thought it was junk mail, and Mom hadn't said a word, just kept stirring her soup while I stood there stunned, wondering if I was losing my mind. I remembered being told to tone it down when I spoke about work, about achievements, about things that made me proud, because it made others feel bad. It all came rushing back in a way that didn't feel nostalgic, but like watching an old home video of a party you weren't actually invited to, one where everyone smiled for the camera but no one looked at you. "I think she hated that you didn't need her." That sentence looped in my mind like a song lyric I hadn't realized was written about me, and I realized that all this time I'd been chasing their approval. What I was really chasing was evidence that I mattered, not to the world, not to students, not to colleagues, but to them, to the people who shared my blood and always made me feel like a ghost at my own dinner table. Daryl reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, slid it across the table like a secret. "What's this?" I asked, voice tighter than I meant it to be. "I don't know if it means anything," he said, "but I found it in her drafts." Her laptop was open when I stopped by the other week. I wasn't snooping, I swear. It was just there. I opened it slowly, the paper trembling just slightly in my hand. It was an email, never sent, from Mom to Janice, dated just days before the award ceremony. "Let her have her night. She always needs to be seen. We've clapped for her long enough. I'm tired of pretending." And there it was. The truth, typed out in black and white, unfiltered, unvarnished, unmistakable. They hadn't forgotten. They hadn't been busy. They'd chosen not to come. Chosen. Not by accident. Not because of scheduling conflicts. But because showing up meant acknowledging me, not as the afterthought, not as the helper, not as the one who kept quiet and kept going, but as someone who deserved to be celebrated without guilt. I looked up at Daryl, who was watching me with the same expression he used to have when we were kids, and he'd break something and wait to see if I'd cover for him. "I'm not mad at you," I said finally. "I think you were just too deep in it to see it clearly." "I was," he said. "But I see it now. And I'm sorry." And for once, the apology didn't feel like a performance. It felt like something broken being acknowledged, not fixed, but seen. We didn't hug. We didn't cry. We just sat there, the night stretching around us like an old coat we both finally realized didn't fit anymore. And that was enough. For now. It's a funny thing, really, how silence can evolve from an empty hallway in your childhood home where no one asked if you needed help, to 4 empty chairs in a crowded banquet room, and, finally, to the quiet after the click of a voicemail message played one too many times, until that silence stops being a background noise and becomes a strategy, a fuel, something you can mold with your own hands like wet clay. I had spent the better part of my life biting my tongue to keep the peace, swallowing insults disguised as concern, and pretending I didn't notice the subtle digs or the careful omissions, the way I was always the last to know about family events, the way my wins were celebrated with the same enthusiasm as someone finding a coupon for canned beans. But after hearing Daryl's voice and reading those words from our mother, not scribbled in anger, not thrown in a moment of rage, but calmly typed and carefully saved like a secret confession, something in me began to shift, not in a fiery or explosive way, but more like tectonic plates moving after years of tension, slow and inevitable, until everything beneath you suddenly feels different. It didn't take long to decide what I was going to do, but it did take effort to make it look effortless. I waited exactly 1 week, long enough for the shock of my speech to sink in, long enough for the voicemail shame spiral to twist around their necks like guilt-flavored pearls, before I sent the text message, short, polite, deceptively warm, "Dinner at my place. Sunday. No pressure, just family." I knew every one of them would read it 3 times, searching for the trap, and that was fine. Let them. Let them wonder if I'd moved on, if I was reaching out to make peace or to draw blood. Because the truth was, even I didn't know which it would be, I only knew that I wanted them at my table, and I wanted to watch them squirm in the very seats they left vacant the night I needed them most. They arrived with the same practiced rhythm they always had, Janice 15 minutes early and dressed like she'd been to the salon that morning, Mom carrying a pie that looked suspiciously store-bought but would, of course, be passed off as homemade, Dad muttering something about traffic while he scanned the room like he wasn't entirely sure where he was, and Daryl asked, hands in his pockets, avoiding eye contact with everyone except me. The table was already set when they arrived, perfectly arranged with matching plates and cloth napkins, the kind of setup that quietly says, "This matters." I'd lit candles, opened wine, even baked chicken from scratch using Mom's old recipe, not to impress them, but to take away any excuses. I didn't want them saying they were distracted by the food or the ambience. I wanted their full attention. And they gave it to me, though not willingly. The first few minutes were awkward but civil, filled with the kind of stiff small talk families use to avoid real conversations, Janice asking about my new haircut like she actually cared, Mom complimenting the centerpiece and then casually mentioning that her friend Joyce's daughter just got promoted at her law firm, as if to remind me that there were still other stars in the sky. But I waited, I smiled, I poured wine, and when the plates were cleared and dessert was about to be served, I got up and walked over to the bookshelf, picked up the framed quote I'd printed after the award night, the one that had made the rounds on social media and ended up in some educational newsletter I didn't even subscribe to, and placed it right in the center of the table, replacing the pie. To the family who didn't clap for me then, don't fake it now. Janice's fork froze halfway to her mouth. Mom shifted in her seat. Dad blinked slowly like he was trying to decipher whether this was a joke or a test. Daryl, to his credit, didn't move at all. He just watched. I let the silence hang there, thick and deliberate, before I reached under the table and pulled out the speaker I'd hidden behind the chair leg earlier that day. I clicked it on, and one by one, I played the voicemails they'd left me, all of them, in full, without commentary, without judgment. Just their own words, echoing back at them now in the open, no longer protected by the privacy of my phone. When Janice's message played the part where she said, "We've all had our struggles, you're not the only one," I saw her lips press into a thin, colorless line, as if willing herself to disappear. When Mom's voice said, "You didn't have to make a scene. You really hurt a lot of feelings," she let out a small gasp and tried to interrupt, but I raised my hand and kept the speaker going. And when Dad's gravelly voice admitted, "We figured you'd be fine either way," the room seemed to shrink, like the air itself had decided it didn't want to stay in the presence of such cowardice. And then I turned off the speaker, looked each of them in the eye, and said, "That's what I got instead of applause." Nobody spoke for a while. Not Janice, who was usually the first to launch into defense mode. Not Mom, who was no stranger to passive-aggressive comebacks cloaked in maternal wisdom. Not even Dad, who'd spent his entire life hiding behind silence and now found it weaponized against him. Eventually, Janice cleared her throat and muttered something about how uncomfortable this was. I leaned in, not loud but steady, and replied, "Good. It was uncomfortable for me too. For the last 40 years. Mom tried to pull out the old reliable family unity, faith, forgiveness, but her words fell flat, like a sermon no one believed anymore, not even the preacher. "You said in your email that you were tired of pretending," I said, sliding a printed copy of the draft she never sent across the table. "So I figured you'd appreciate a night where we all stop pretending." That's when I dropped the real bomb, a set of envelopes I'd spent the week preparing, each one addressed in my handwriting, each one containing a copy of the new version of my will and a letter explaining what they were entitled to after my death, which, as it turned out, was absolutely nothing. Their hands shook as they opened them, and their faces changed in ways that no apology could fix, not because of the money, because truth be told, I didn't have a fortune, but because I had removed their assumed seat at the table. I had stripped them of their roles in a story they thought they were starring in. I had written them out of the final chapters, not in rage, but in clarity. I stood up, thanked them for coming, and walked out of the dining room, leaving them to their uneaten pie and their crumbling egos. Behind me, I heard chairs creak, a fork fall, someone sigh, but I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. The message had been delivered. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for anyone to understand me. I had created a space where they had to face themselves, and whether they liked what they saw wasn't my problem. I closed the door to my bedroom, slipped out of my heels, and lay on the bed staring at the ceiling, not smiling, not crying, just breathing slowly, deeply, fully, like someone who had finally exhaled after holding it in for far too long. Let them sit with their discomfort. I had sat with mine for a lifetime. The days that followed the dinner were strange in a way that's hard to articulate without sounding theatrical, because they weren't filled with dramatic confrontations or sudden changes of heart, or even explosive rage from my family, no. What came next was much quieter, more calculated, more pathetic in its own deeply human way, a series of small, transparent attempts to rewrite the narrative, to regain control over the image of what kind of family we had been, and more importantly, what kind of people they still desperately needed the world to believe they were. It started with Janice, of course, who wasted no time crafting a carefully staged Facebook post the very next morning, a filtered, polished photo of a bouquet of flowers, which I am fairly certain she didn't even buy herself, resting next to a printed copy of my award photo, captioned with something nauseating like, "So proud of my sister for everything she's accomplished. Couldn't be there, but cheering from afar. Hashtag proud sister, hashtag family love, hashtag always supporting." I stared at that post for almost 5 full minutes, not even angry, just astounded by the sheer audacity of it, as though the act of typing out a lie for strangers to, somehow made up for decades of absence, as though digital applause could be exchanged for real presence, as though public validation could somehow make her feel less exposed after being dragged, even silently, into the light of who she really was. I didn't comment, not because I didn't want to, but because the silence I had wielded at the dinner table had become far more effective than any sarcastic reply could be. But I did upload one photo to my own page, just one, no caption, just the image from the ceremony of me standing alone on stage, holding the plaque with 4 unmistakably empty chairs in the front row. That was all. It said everything. Within an hour, she deleted her post. Mom called the next afternoon, voice thin and trembling, not from illness or age, but from the effort it took to sound composed while trying to navigate a conversation she no longer controlled. She started with her usual script: concern, confusion, maternal disapproval dressed as worry, but it didn't land the same way anymore, because I wasn't the same anymore. She asked me if I felt better now, like my boundary setting had been some childish tantrum I'd needed to get out of my system, as if exposing their neglect had been some emotional hiccup I should now be ready to move past. I listened, let her ramble, let her weave her tapestry of revisionist memory, how she always tried her best, how nobody's perfect, how we never meant to make you feel that way. And when she finally paused, waiting for the inevitable softening she was used to, the moment when I'd usually meet her halfway out of guilt or habit, I told her, very calmly, that I believed she had indeed tried her best, but that her best was never enough, not for me, not in the ways that mattered. I said I no longer had the bandwidth to carry both my accomplishments and their shame at the same time, and that I was done handing out forgiveness like discount coupons to people who never paid full price for my pain. She cried, of course. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a soft, stifled kind of cry that made me think, for a moment, that she wasn't sad for what she'd done, but for the fact that she could no longer undo it. Then came Dad, who hadn't spoken to me directly in years unless prompted by someone else, but now apparently felt compelled to reach out, and his version of contrition came in the form of a 2-minute voicemail where he said, in that same monotone voice I had known since childhood, heard about what happened. Guess we could have done things different. Anyway, I'm proud. Just wanted you to know that. Take care. I listened to that message twice, not because I needed to hear it, but because I was trying to understand what he thought he was accomplishing. Did he really believe that a lifetime of indifference could be smoothed over with 2.5 sentences? That we could have done things different was somehow a substitute for, we failed you, and we never even noticed? But the truth is, I didn't need more. Not from him. Not anymore. I had stopped chasing that version of closure years ago, and what I had finally built, that sharp, quiet wall of self-respect, was stronger than whatever dusty bridge he was trying to cross now. And maybe that's the saddest part of all, not that they never clapped for me when I needed them to, but that when they finally did try to clap, it wasn't for me at all. It was for the idea of me, the public version, the sanitized, successful daughter they could claim without doing any of the work of knowing. Then came the email from the district, short, formal, and packed with a kind of reverent urgency, inviting me to deliver the keynote address at the upcoming National Educators Conference, an event so large, so respected, that I had to read the email 3 times before I let myself believe it was real. They'd seen the video. They'd read the quote. They said it had touched something deep in the educator community. They wanted that same honesty, that same presence, in front of thousands. I sat on the edge of my bed, phone in hand, sunlight streaming through the blinds, and felt something I hadn't felt in years, not validation, not revenge, but something cleaner, quieter, like breathing in a room where the air is finally clear after years of dust. The day of the conference, I stood backstage in a new black dress that made me feel exactly how I wanted to feel, sharp, grounded, unapologetic. The auditorium was massive, rows upon rows of educators, administrators, and guests all waiting. I walked out to the podium, the lights hitting my face, and as I stood there, I didn't think about who might be watching from behind a screen, or which relatives were lurking on social media, or what Mom and Dad would say if they saw the footage later. I thought only of the 4 empty chairs from that night, not with anger, not with sadness, but with the kind of clean detachment that only comes when you've truly let something go. I didn't scan the crowd for familiar faces. I didn't brace for disappointment. I smiled, Not because I was performing, but because I was finally where I belonged, not just in front of a room full of strangers who saw my worth, but within myself, fully, without apology or hesitation. And as the applause swelled, rich, real, earned, I whispered, almost inaudibly, into the mic. I stopped waiting for them to clap. Now I clap for myself. And damn, it's loud. Whether they heard that or not, I didn't care. They had their chance. This one was mine.